Dorian Fields set the fresh glass down in front of Serena Langford and stepped back without a word. He made it 2 steps before the manager's hand closed around his arm. Peter Sloan pulled him away from the table, voice low and cutting, accusing him of tampering with a VIP guest's drink. Dorian didn't argue. He didn't explain. He only turned back long enough to look at Serena and say 4 words. "Don't drink the old glass." Then security walked him out, his employee badge already gone from his pocket. 5 minutes later, a man who had arrived late to the dinner picked up the glass Dorian had left on the side table, assumed it was his, and drank. He was on the floor before anyone could reach him. Serena stood at the edge of the room, watching the man collapse, watching Gavin Locke's eyes go straight to the glass instead of to the man dying on the carpet. She ran. She found Dorian in the service alley, coat still in his hand. When she looked at him, something in her face had already broken. If you're new here, this channel tells the stories of people who did the right thing when it cost them everything and what happened next. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Dorian Fields had learned to move through expensive rooms like he wasn't in them. It was a skill the same way reading a centrifuge result was a skill, or knowing when a compound had been altered at the molecular level. You trained yourself until it became reflex. At Belmont House, the reflex was different. Keep your eyes down. Refill glasses before they emptied. Never let the guests feel watched. The dining room ran on the illusion that everything happened by itself, that the food arrived because it wanted to, that the silence between courses was natural and not carefully managed by 6 people moving in quiet coordination around the edges of the room. Dorian was good at the illusion. He had been doing it for 2 years. What the other servers didn't know, what Peter Sloan had never thought to ask, was that Dorian Fields held a certification in pharmaceutical compound analysis from a program most people in the city had never heard of. He had spent 11 years in a laboratory before he ever picked up a serving tray. Testing drug batches, logging results, writing reports that described with precision what was inside a substance and what it would do to a human body at a given dose. He lost that career on a Tuesday morning 4 years ago when he submitted a report flagging an inconsistency in a batch of sedative compounds his company was preparing to ship to regional distributors. The report was accurate, the data was clean, his methodology was sound, none of it mattered. Within 2 weeks, the company had reframed the findings, reassigned the error to Dorian, and terminated his contract on grounds of procedural misconduct. The formal record described him as an employee who had falsified testing results. It did not describe what he had actually done, which was find the falsification someone else had already committed. After that, he stopped trying to explain. Explanations required trust, and trust required a foundation, and the foundation had been removed the moment his professional record was rewritten by people with lawyers he could never afford to match. Now he had Theo. Theo was 8 and wanted to be an astronaut, which Dorian privately thought was a reasonable goal for a kid who had already survived more disruption than most adults. Theo's mother had died in a car accident 4 years ago, the same year Dorian lost his job, and the two of them had reorganized their lives around each other with the quiet efficiency of people who didn't have the luxury of falling apart for long. Dorian worked evenings at Belmont House so he could take Theo to school in the mornings. On his off days, he repaired medical equipment for a small firm across town. It wasn't what he had trained for. It was enough. He was thinking about Theo's science project, something involving water filtration, when he first noticed Gavin Locke. The private dining room on the upper floor had been reserved for a party of 4. Serena Langford sat at the head of the table with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to being watched. She was 39, with the controlled posture that came from years of walking into rooms where people had already formed opinions about her before she spoke. She ran Langford Medical Supply, which meant she ran the distribution network that moved pharmaceuticals and medical equipment to hundreds of hospitals across the region. It was not a small company. It was not a simple operation, and it had not been easy to hold since her father died and left her a board that questioned every decision she made. The man she trusted most was Gavin Locke. I had been with the Langford family for nearly 18 years, first as her father's operational director and then as her own. He was 61, silver-haired, and carried the specific confidence of a man who had never been seriously challenged. That evening, he was trying to get Serena to sign a merger with a pharmaceutical distribution company that had approached Langford 6 months earlier. The deal was worth several $100 million, and Gavin had been advocating for it steadily, patiently for most of those 6 months. Serena had not signed. She wanted her legal team to review the clauses governing warehouse access and transport oversight before she committed to anything. It was not an unusual request. It was in fact the only reasonable thing to do before signing an agreement of that scale. Gavin had explained several times that the timeline was sensitive and the other party wasn't inclined to wait. Serena had explained several times that she didn't sign documents her lawyers hadn't read. The conversation had been repeating itself in different forms all evening. Dorian wasn't listening to any of it. He was doing his job, noticing Gavin the way he noticed most things in that room peripherally, without appearing to pay attention. When Serena stepped away to take a phone call, Gavin rose and moved toward the service counter, saying he wanted more ice. There was nothing strange about that. Guests wandered toward the service area now, and then especially in private rooms where the boundaries were softer. What was strange was how long Gavin stood at the far end of the counter. There was nothing there that required 30 seconds of attention. The ice was at the other end, and the server who went for it was back in under a minute. But Gavin lingered at the corner nearest the preparation tray that had been set up specifically for Serena's drinks long enough that Dorian logged it without meaning to. It was the same instinct that had made him a good lab technician, anomalies registered before he consciously decided to look for them. He didn't say anything. He kept moving. When he collected the drink tray several minutes later, something stopped him before he reached the table. It was faint, the kind of thing you'd miss entirely if you'd never worked in a room where faint things mattered. There was a thin film along the inner rim of Serena's glass. Not quite residue, not quite condensation. And beneath the ambient scent of the room, something sharp and synthetic that had no business being there. Dorian stood at the service station with the tray in his hands and ran through it the way he'd been trained to, quickly and methodically. He had tested a class of fast-acting sedative compounds 11 years ago. At low doses, they were nearly colorless and gave off no real odor in open air. They caused dizziness, impaired judgment, and short-term memory disruption. They were not fatal in a healthy adult at the concentrations required for a rapid effect. What they did do extremely well was open a window of altered cognition, a period during which a person might agree to things they'd never normally agree to and then fail to accurately recall that they had agreed at all. He didn't know Gavin had put something in the glass. He couldn't prove it. What he knew was that the glass held something that hadn't been there when it left the preparation station, and that the only person who had been near that station without a clear purpose was Gavin Locke. Dorian made a decision. He reached for a fresh, sealed bottle of water, set it on the tray, and lifted Serena's original glass away, using the cloth service towel he kept folded at his waist, a habit from his lab years handling sample containers without introducing contamination from his own hands. He set the glass on the side table near the service station, not discarded, set aside deliberately, towel still wrapped around the base. He had worked in places where the difference between those two things decided whether evidence existed at all. If he was wrong about what he'd smelled, nothing would come of it. If he was right, the towel might be the only thing that ever recorded contact with whatever had been placed in that glass. He brought Serena the sealed bottle. Peter Sloane saw the exchange and reached him before he could get back to the station. The confrontation was brief and unpleasant. Peter wanted to know why he'd touched a VIP guest's drink without authorization. Dorian said the glass had shown signs of contamination and needed to be held for testing. He kept his voice even. He chose his words carefully. He did not use the word poison because he understood what that word would do to a room full of people who hadn't been told anything yet. Gavin Locke spoke before Peter had finished processing the explanation. His tone was measured, almost regretful, the voice of a man who had seen situations like this before and knew how they ended. He suggested calmly that the server might be overreacting, that the appropriate procedure would have been to notify management, rather than act alone, that it was hard to understand why anyone would substitute a guest's drink without authorization unless they had a reason to manufacture a situation. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse Dorian directly. He simply arranged the facts in a sequence that led somewhere convenient. Peter made his decision based on math. Gavin Locke was the reason this party had booked the private room. The private room was the reason Belmont House had a waiting list on Friday evenings. Dorian's badge was collected. Security walked him toward the rear exit. At the door, he turned back. Serena was watching him from across the room with an expression he couldn't fully read. Skeptical, uncertain, caught between 18 years of loyalty to one man and 4 minutes of contact with another. He didn't try to explain everything. There wasn't time, and she wouldn't have believed him anyway. He said the only thing that might actually matter. Don't drink anything that isn't sealed. Then he was outside, coat in hand, standing in the service alley behind the building. Serena had not stopped Gavin from redirecting the room. She had not intervened when Peter made his call, but she had noticed something no one else in that room was positioned to notice because no one else knew Gavin Locke the way she did. When Peter and the others turned toward Dorian, Gavin looked away from the glass, not at Dorian, not at the door, sideways toward nothing. A man with nothing to hide looks at the thing being discussed. Gavin didn't. She filed it away without knowing what to do with it. Then the investor arrived late, sat in the wrong seat, and picked up the glass on the side table. He was on the floor in under a minute, and Gavin's eyes in the single unguarded second before he composed himself went straight to that glass. Serena was running before she'd decided to run. She covered the distance to the service alley and found Dorian still there, coat in hand, not yet gone. When she reached him, she wasn't composed anymore. Whatever stillness she'd held for the past 2 hours had been replaced by something raw and more honest. She looked at him the way people look at the one person still standing after everything else has fallen. "You knew what was in that glass," she said. "Help me." Dorian went back inside. He didn't want to. He had spent 2 years building a life that required him to want nothing more than what he already had: a job, a routine, a son who still believed his father could handle whatever came next. Walking back through the service entrance of Belmont House was the opposite of that life. It was the kind of decision that opened doors he had spent 4 years keeping shut. He went anyway because the man on the floor was still breathing in shallow, irregular pulls. And nobody in that room knew what he had swallowed or how to manage what came next. He knelt beside the man, checked his airway, pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck, and started talking in a voice that was low, clear, and left no room for argument. He told the nearest server to keep the man on his side. He told another to call an ambulance and stay on the line. He told a third, the one reaching for the glass on the side table, not to touch it. "Don't touch anything on that table," he said. "Not the glass, not the napkin, nothing." The server pulled her hand back. Serena was behind him. He could feel her there without looking. Gavin Locke had moved to the far end of the room near the door, speaking quietly into his phone. The man on the floor began to stabilize as Dorian talked him through slow, controlled breathing. His color returned. His pulse was irregular but present. Whatever had been in that glass had been dosed carefully, which told Dorian something important about the person who prepared it. You didn't dose carefully if you were trying to kill someone. You dosed carefully if you needed them functional for a specific window of time and incapacitated afterward. When the ambulance arrived, Dorian stood and turned to Peter Sloane, who hadn't moved from the center of the room since the man collapsed. He gave him 3 instructions. "Lock this room. Pull the security footage from the past 2 hours and back it up before anyone touches the system. Keep that glass exactly where it is and call the police." Peter looked at him the way people look at someone who no longer has any authority to tell them what to do. "You don't work here anymore," Peter said. "I know," Dorian said. "Do it anyway." Gavin crossed the room before Peter could respond. His expression had reset into something resembling concern. The performance of a man who cared deeply and wanted very much to resolve this cleanly and quickly. He suggested the investor be taken to Langford Medical Supply's private hospital affiliate rather than a public emergency room. He suggested the episode might be an allergic reaction or a personal medication the man had taken earlier. He suggested gently that involving the police at this stage might complicate things before anyone understood what had actually happened. Every suggestion pointed the same way: away from the glass, away from the footage, away from the question of how a sedative ended up in a drink prepared for someone else. Dorian said, "If that glass disappears or gets cleaned, you lose the only evidence of what happened tonight." Gavin looked at him. It was a brief look, less than a second, communicating nothing on the surface, but it confirmed what Dorian had suspected from the moment he saw the man standing at the wrong end of the service counter. Serena stepped forward and spoke before Gavin could redirect the conversation again. "Lock the room," she told Peter. "Call the police. Don't touch the glass." Then she turned to Dorian. "What do you need?" he told her. He needed Theo safe. He said it directly, without hedging. If the people behind whatever had happened tonight decided he was a problem, the first thing they'd reach for was the person closest to him. Theo was 8 and took the same route home from school every afternoon. Dorian was not willing to leave that variable unmanaged. Serena made a phone call. 12 minutes later, one of her personal security staff was parked outside Theo's babysitter's building. The preliminary results came back within hours. The glass contained a controlled sedative, a fast-acting anxiolytic that suppressed short-term memory consolidation at moderate doses. It was not a lethal amount for a healthy adult. It was precisely calibrated to produce roughly 60 minutes of impaired judgment while leaving the subject conscious and responsive. Dorian laid it out for Serena and her legal team in a conference room 3 blocks away. The compound wouldn't have killed her. It would have made her agreeable foggy and incapable of accurately encoding what she agreed to. By morning, she'd have held only a partial fragmented memory of the evening. She might not have been able to say with certainty whether she had signed anything or what the signing had felt like. The legal team asked to see the merger agreement Gavin had brought to the table. It took them 40 minutes to find the clause. It was buried in an appendix written in language that achieved its purpose through accumulation layering dependent clauses and conditional definitions until the core meaning was nearly inaccessible without reading it 3 times with a specific eye for what it was hiding. The clause established that in the event a CEO was formally assessed as unable to make sound executive decisions, operational authority over the company's warehouse and transport networks would transfer on a temporary basis to the chief operating officer. The trigger for that assessment was not incapacitation. It was observable impairment in a professional context. Gavin had planned to let Serena sign the agreement in a state that any witness in that room would read as emotionally unstable or cognitively compromised. The signature would be valid. Her condition would be documented. The clause would activate before she fully understood what had happened. Serena's investigators working through the night traced the merger partner through a sequence of holding companies and subsidiaries. 3 of those entities were controlled by relatives of Gavin Locke. The pharmaceutical distribution company at the center of the deal was not primarily a distribution company. It was a pass-through for moving substandard drug batches and uncertified medical equipment through networks that carried the reputational legitimacy of established suppliers. Langford Medical Supply, with its long compliance record and its hospital relationships, was the final cover layer. The plan was not to steal a company. The plan was to use a company's credibility to ship products that should never have reached a patient. Dorian listened to the investigators walk through the structure, and he recognized it. He had seen this shape before. Different players, different network, same architecture. The same logic that had ended his career 4 years ago was sitting in front of him in a new set of documents run by people who had gotten considerably better at hiding it. He didn't say any of that out loud. He said, "We need to move before he realizes how much you know." They didn't move fast enough. Gavin had resources and he used them. By the following morning, he had located Dorian's employment history, not the version Dorian carried in his memory, but the formal record, the one describing a pharmaceutical technician terminated for procedural misconduct and suspected result falsification. He brought it to the board in a 20-minute presentation, structured with the same careful method he'd applied in the dining room. He built a story in which a disgruntled former industry employee carrying a documented history of misconduct had introduced a substance into a VIP guest's drink and then positioned himself as the person who discovered it. He built a version in which Serena Langford, under emotional strain following her father's death, had responded to a staged crisis by sharing confidential company information with someone she'd known for less than 12 hours. He framed the real threat to Langford Medical Supply not as the merger or the people behind it, but as the CEO's judgment. He didn't shout any of it. He'd been doing this for 18 years. Peter Sloan provided a statement confirming that Dorian had acted alone, that no one had witnessed Gavin near the drink, and that in his assessment the incident had been initiated by the server, who had then been rewarded with private access to the CEO. The board voted to suspend Serena's executive authority pending investigation. Gavin took operational control of the company's data systems within the hour. Serena's access credentials were deactivated. Security staff people who'd worked in that building for years were told to escort her from the premises. She left without making a scene. Dorian was waiting on the street outside. While this was happening, the independent lab holding the original glass notified Serena's legal team that the sample had been replaced. The physical evidence was gone. The chain of custody had been broken at a point that made the original results inadmissible. That same afternoon, Theo's route home was followed by a car that parked half a block from the babysitter's building and sat there for 45 minutes before driving away. Dorian received a photograph of it from his security contact. There was no note. None was needed. Serena said they should relocate. Dorian said no. He had made this calculation before. 4 years ago, he had lost his job, his professional record, and his ability to work in the field he'd trained for, and he had absorbed it and rebuilt around it because he'd decided the cost of fighting was higher than the cost of starting over. He had been wrong about the math. The people he declined to fight had kept operating. They were operating now in a different configuration with higher stakes. And part of the reason they'd gotten this far was that men like Dorian had looked at the odds and chosen the smaller life. He was not willing to make that choice again. "If I go quiet," he said, "the drugs get shipped, the equipment gets delivered, and someone who walks into a hospital for something routine gets a product that was never tested properly. I've already watched that happen once. I'm not going to watch it happen again because I decided it was safer to leave." Serena didn't argue. Dorian had stayed in contact with one person from his laboratory years. Her name was Maya Reeves, and she'd worked 2 benches over in the same testing division for the 3 years before he was terminated. She had known his report was accurate. She'd come to his apartment the week after his firing, told him she was scared and couldn't say anything publicly while she was still employed, and said she was sorry. Before she left that night, she told him one more thing quietly, that she had copied the original testing data onto a personal hard drive and didn't know if she'd ever be able to use it, but she couldn't bring herself to delete it either. She kept it because erasing it felt like agreeing it had never existed. Dorian had not forgotten that conversation. He called her now and asked. Maya agreed to hand the drive over, but she wanted him to come in person. She didn't trust digital transfer, not because she was being dramatic, but because she'd spent enough time in that industry to know exactly what people with lawyers and IT resources could intercept and delete. She would bring the drive. He would come to her. In the interval between the call and the meeting, Maya went dark. No responses, no confirmation of the location, nothing. Dorian told Serena, and Serena told him to wait. He waited 18 hours. Then Maya called from a number he didn't recognize and gave him an address. When he arrived, she explained. One of Gavin's people had been watching her building. She'd seen the car, recognized the pattern, grown up in a neighborhood where you learn to notice when a car doesn't belong. She had taken the drive out through the basement and moved to her sister's apartment across the city and turned off her phone because she didn't know who had access to what. She set the hard drive on the table between them. "I wasn't going to let them get to this before I could give it to you," she said. "That's all." The data was intact. 11 years of institutional memory compressed onto a single drive, the original batch results, the internal emails requesting that Dorian's findings be reclassified, and the correspondence between the lab's senior director and a procurement officer from one of the companies currently listed in Gavin Locke's distribution network. The same company, the same network. The thread ran from a testing lab 4 years ago straight to the merger agreement sitting unsigned on a conference table, unsigned because Serena Langford had declined and Gavin had decided the solution to her refusal was chemistry. Dorian had been fired for finding the first piece of this. He was now holding all of it. He called Serena and told her they needed to move that night. Gavin was preparing to send the first shipment out of the central warehouse before any regulatory authority could freeze the inventory. Serena said she would meet him there. The central warehouse for Langford Medical Supply sat on the eastern edge of an industrial block 12 minutes from the city's main hospital corridor. On any given night, its contents represented the supply chain for surgical wards, oncology units, pediatric pharmacies, and emergency departments across the region. Tonight, a portion of those contents was about to leave through the loading dock on a transport contract authorized under operational powers. Gavin Locke had held for less than 24 hours. When Dorian and Serena arrived, the signing was already in progress. Gavin had arranged the space with the instinct of a man who understood that theater mattered. A table sat near the center of the floor. The board representatives were seated. The investors were standing. The documents were laid out in a sequence that implied the outcome was settled and the gathering was a formality. Gavin saw them come through the door and took about 2 seconds to recalibrate. Then he smiled. "This is a restricted area," he said. "Ms. Langford's access credentials have been suspended pending the board's investigation. As for Mr. Fields, he let the pause do its work. I'm not sure what authority he imagines he has in this building." Nobody at the table moved. Dorian walked to the nearest clear surface and set down three things: a sealed evidence bag holding the cloth service towel from Belmont House, a printed report from an independent forensic testing facility, and a hard copy of the original pharmaceutical testing data from 11 years ago, tabbed and indexed the relevant correspondence printed in full. He didn't explain what any of it was. He stepped back. Gavin looked at the items, then at the people around him, and made one final attempt. He said the documents were fabricated. He said Dorian had demonstrated a pattern of manufactured evidence going back more than a decade. He said Serena had been manipulated by someone with a personal grievance and a talent for convincing stories, and that the board had already reviewed the facts and reached its conclusion. His voice was steady. His posture was composed. He was very good at this, even now, even here. But the room had shifted in the way rooms shift when the people in them are no longer certain which direction is safe. Serena opened her phone and connected it to the warehouse's auxiliary audio system, a personal device link she kept separate from her corporate credentials, tied to the building's backup speaker channel rather than its administrative network. The audio that played had been recovered by her IT team from Belmont House's archived communication logs. The restaurant's private dining rooms were fitted with a recording function tied to its event management system, used for quality review of service stored automatically on a local server Gavin had never known to locate or wipe. The voice on the recording was his. He was speaking to someone whose responses had been deleted, but his half of the conversation was intact. He said the compound needed to act within 20 minutes of ingestion. He said the effect had to last at least an hour but could not produce visible sedation. She needed to be present and responsive. He said that under no circumstances should she lose consciousness before the documents were signed. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the thing everyone came to discuss has been replaced by something nobody expected. Gavin moved toward the exit on the south side. The doors opened before he reached them. 4 officers from the city's Economic Crimes Division came through, first followed by 2 investigators from the Federal Pharmaceutical Regulatory Authority, followed by Serena's attorney with a court order freezing all outbound shipments from the facility pending a full inventory audit. The cargo manifest for the night was pulled and cross-referenced against the regulatory database on site. Of the 9 product lines listed for transport, 6 carried batch identifiers that matched no registered testing record. 3 of those batches included devices scheduled for surgical use in 3 separate hospital systems the following week. None of it had been tested. All of it had paperwork that said it had. Gavin had stopped walking. He stood near the south wall with his hands at his sides, watching the sequence of events with the expression of a man whose calculations had stopped working. He looked at Dorian. "If you hadn't changed that glass," he said, "all of this would already be finished." Dorian looked back. "No," he said, "it started ending the moment you decided to poison someone's trust." Gavin was arrested on charges of criminal conspiracy to commit assault by poisoning, financial fraud, falsification of medical documentation, and distribution of adulterated pharmaceutical products. The board met 4 days later and reversed its suspension of Serena's executive authority. She did not accept the restoration as though it settled anything. She requested time on the agenda before any operational business, and she used it to say in precise and unambiguous terms that she had watched a man be removed from a building for doing the right thing and had not intervened. She did not frame it as a failure of information. She said it in front of the full board in language that made no attempt to redistribute responsibility. Then she made 4 requests. She asked that Belmont House provide a formal written apology to Dorian Fields and financial restitution for wrongful termination, or face the end of Langford Medical Supply's standing event contract with the restaurant. Peter Sloan had deliberately withheld information to protect a commercial relationship and had given a false statement to the board's investigation, and she expected that addressed. She asked the legal team to file for a formal reopening of the misconduct case that had ended Dorian's pharmaceutical career. The original testing data, now in evidence, demonstrated that his report had been accurate, that the findings had been altered by senior leadership at the request of a procurement client, and that he'd been terminated specifically because he identified the alteration. She asked that Maya Reeves be formally acknowledged in any public account of the investigation and that a separate legal process be initiated on her behalf if she chose to pursue it. Maya had preserved evidence at personal risk for 4 years in silence and isolation without acknowledgement, and Serena intended to make sure it was treated as something. Her fourth request was directed at Dorian, who was waiting in a conference room down the hall. She came in alone and closed the door. She said she wanted to offer him a position building and leading an independent quality assurance division for Langford's full transport and distribution network, responsible for testing protocols, third-party audits, batch verification, and incident reporting. Dorian listened. He asked one question. Who does the division report to? Serena told him it would report directly to the company's audit committee, a body of external board members, with no operational line to the CEO's office or to any executive director. Its findings could not be filtered, delayed, or redacted by anyone in a management role, including her. Dorian considered it for a moment. Then yes, he said. The case against his former employer resolved 7 weeks later. The original testing data was admitted into evidence. The internal correspondence requesting the reclassification of his findings was authenticated. The company issued a public statement acknowledging that the misconduct finding against Dorian Fields had been incorrectly applied and that his termination had resulted from the accurate identification of internal procedural violations by company leadership, not from any error or falsification on his part. Dorian read the statement once and put it in the same drawer where he kept Theo's school drawings, and the few things he needed to keep but not to look at often. He called Maya after it was released. She was quiet for a long time, then said it felt strange to be relieved about something that should never have required 4 years of silence. He said he knew exactly what she meant. 4 months after this night at Belmont House, Dorian stood in front of 412 Langford Medical Supply employees and presented the framework for the company's new independent safety and quality control division. Theo sat in the third row in a tie he had chosen himself that did not match his shirt, watching his father with the focused attention of a child who understood that this moment was different from other moments, even if the full reasons weren't clear yet. Serena introduced Dorian by reading his actual professional history, the certifications, the years in pharmaceutical testing, the report that had cost him his career and turned out to be entirely correct. She read it without editorializing. The record stood on its own. Dorian's remarks were not long. He talked about accountability as a system design problem, not a character problem about how organizations failed, not because people were uniformly dishonest, but because the structures they operated in made honesty expensive and silence cheap. He said the division existed to change that math. In his desk drawer was his old Belmont House badge corners. Clipped the word "terminated" stamped across the back. He kept it because he wanted to remember the exact sensation of being walked out of a building for doing something right, so that he never confused the two things, being dismissed and being wrong. They were not the same thing. They had never been the same thing. Serena changed how she moved through the company. She started going to the places where the real information lived. The loading docks at 5 in the morning, the inventory rooms, the dispatch stations where drivers signed out before routes that began before the executive floors were staffed. She asked questions, and then stayed long enough to hear the answers. She learned the names of people who had worked in the building for a decade without ever being in the same room as a member of leadership. She was not performing this. She was correcting something. The week after Dorian's presentation, Serena walked into a quarterly review and found a glass of water waiting at her seat. She didn't pick it up right away. She turned to the server who had just placed it there, asked his name, thanked him, and checked the seal on the bottle beside it. At the back of the room, Dorian noticed. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. 5 minutes was how long it had taken for everything to fall apart in that dining room at Belmont House. 5 minutes between the moment a man was walked out a door and the moment the person who let it happen came running after him asking for help. But the change that followed the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding something that should have been built differently the first time took considerably longer. It took a man who had already lost everything once deciding he was willing to lose it again rather than look away, and a woman who had been wrong about who was worth listening to finally learning to listen. The most dangerous people in any room are not always the ones with the loudest voice or the highest title. Sometimes they are the ones who have spent years making themselves invisible. Learning to see what others overlook, waiting for the moment when looking away is no longer something they can live with. Dorian Fields was fired for changing a glass of water. He was right about what was in it. He was right about what it would cost him to say so. He said so anyway, not because he was fearless, but because the alternative was watching someone get hurt and knowing he had chosen to let it happen. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the